Okay, so this is the second, I guess, presentation in the sort of concepts and terms. So last time I went over this whole idea of the different sort of branches of geography and where it came from. Now, what I want to do this time is we're going to start a whole series of sort of examinations into the sort of general concepts and, in some cases, measures that we use when we're actually looking at things. Because you have to remember, if we're looking at things from a regional context, which is this class, if you're going to look at why something happens in a particular region or why it doesn't, and you want to compare that to another region, you have to have a standard set of terms and concepts that you're going to use that you apply, to irregardless of location. And so, this is one of the basic premises of geography, is sort of a comparative idea of different environments, or the way that different people operate in the same environment, whichever way you want to look at it. So we're very big on the idea of sort of defined concepts and logics that everyone agrees on, if you would, a common language and a common set of perceptions, so we can both talk about the things and we can also compare them, from one person to another. The three basic concepts in all the branches of geography is this idea of place, space, and region. And as typical with the discipline, it's a very complicated discipline, geography, simply because it is so all-encompassing. And yet you're looking at details. So you've got this sort of contradiction of totality, that you're looking at, people in the world, basically. In fact, people and the world, including space. On one hand. On the other hand, you're looking at the population living in Pololo, and maybe people on one street versus people on the other side of the street. So, place and space are absolutely central to the way that geographers look at, sort of understand and interpret the world around them. Space is very simply a bounded area. So if you talk about, for example, Pololo, figuring out what are the boundaries of Pololo, where does Pololo start, where does it stop, where does it become St. Louis Heights or Wilhelmina Rise or Kaimul Key? Is there sort of a Mauka Pololo or a back part of Pololo like Pukele, because there certainly is Waimau, or is it all just one thing? And then when you actually talk to people in the valley, they might have a different view of what the space is. They might not see it as Pololo, and might have discrete units that they actually see that outsiders don't identify. If you're from the mainland, and you're talking about Honolulu, you're probably just going to see it as part of Honolulu. If you're for someone really far away, you just might see it as part of Hawaii in the sense of the state. So space, as with almost all the concepts we're going to look at, is on one hand definable, but it's also definable, but within the context of the beholder, essentially the person that's making the statement. So space is something where you can actually see what the boundaries are. It's here, it stops there. It doesn't include this, it doesn't include that. So it's a descriptive term. It's also one that we use a lot when you're comparing things. If you ever get involved in marketing, for example, or communications, especially marketing, space is a hugely important concept, because that defines, where for example, you're going to spend your advertising money. Who can drive to your T-Presso location is based to a certain extent on space. Now, a subset of that would be place. And place is even more arbitrary than space is, in the sense that place is something that an individual or a group identify as a point that they actually have a sense of. So for example, if you're a Chaminade student, theoretically Chaminade University would be a place. If you're not a Chaminade student and you're not in Hawaii, it probably isn't, because you've never heard of it. So place, again, is arbitrary. And we see this all the time here in Hawaii. It's not unique to Hawaii, but it's really common here. It's different people can have very, very different views of the same location. So to a certain extent, on one hand, it's one place because it's the same location, but they can have very different ideas of what that place consists of and what it means. A good example here, if you're familiar with local history, would be Iolani Palace. To the tourism authority here, it's a place that people go to because it's a historic palace and it generates tourism dollars, and it's something that people want to see, and it's in downtown historic Honolulu, etc. If you're a part of a Hawaiian sovereignty group that's still upset about the overthrow of 1898, then you see it as maybe as a signal or a sign of the fact that from that moment on, Hawaiians were oppressed and not in charge of their own political identity. So the building's the same. Where it is the same, but it's a different place in the sense that, on the one hand, it shares some factors, but people's view of what it means and what it stands for is different. It's oftentimes pointed out that places is, in many cases, when you're talking to people, places are something that have some sort of emotional content. They mean something to people, and that's probably the easiest way to think of place. Space, maybe, but place definitely is something that people have some sort of emotional or social or some sort of cognitive link to. Region is a term that we see obviously with this course, regional geography, but region is also basically a giant version of space. So if you're talking about a region, you're usually talking about a large space, relatively speaking, that has some consistent factor that makes it different than the areas around it. So for example, when we look at the European Union, when we go to Europe, look at Europe, that would be, the European Union would be a region. It's a whole slew of countries. They're all tied together by virtue of a contractual relationship, and they have all this, that, and the other thing going on. And this is in contrast to the countries that are not part of the EU. So a region is like a big version of space that's defined by one particular set of parameters. So on one hand, you've got the European Union, but on the other hand, two of the members, for example, are France and Italy. And those two are very different countries, and they are separate countries, and they have separate stuff they do. They have separate attitude and values. So on one hand, from a political military sense, they're part of a thing called the European Union. In other ways, they're not. So region tends to be a very specific concept, or it's a bounded area that's defined by a specific concept. If you want to think of football, for example, where you're going to find Las Vegas Raiders fans would be regional in the sense that you could actually go and, I'm sure there's some marketing company that does this. They can actually say, we're the people that watch those games, say on pay-per-view, that buy that logo merchandise and stuff like that, where they are and where they aren't. Now, from another context, it might not be visible. It might not have anything to do, for example, the folks that eat at McDonald's. So regionality is specifically tied to whatever sort of logic or whatever thing you're looking at. Where do you find it and where doesn't it? Or where do you find a lot of it? Where do you find very little of it? So region's probably the easiest of the three in the sense that, as long as you know what someone's criteria is, it's pretty easy to see that. It's usually not all that huge argument about regions. Space and place, oh yeah, that gets complicated. Now in this class particularly, you've got to do map quizzes. And so maps are a big part of geography and have been way back in the way. Maps go back thousands of years and they're found in many societies. Again, when they're part of geography specifically, they're usually tied to either political control, maps that show the boundaries of my space versus space I don't control, or maps that show in terms of how to get somewhere. For example, trade maps, how to get from China to, say, Damascus or Baghdad. So maps are always, and this is without exception, and we'll see one in a second, maps are always two-dimensional representations or interpretations of reality. No map is ever accurate, and this is something that geographers are always pointing out and people always ignore. I just saw another situation in the news a couple of days ago where a family got lost and died because they followed their GPS coordinates in Google Map and ended up caught in a snowstorm and died because they're in the middle of nowhere. And on one hand, that's really sad. On the other hand, if you're a geographer, it's like, why would you trust, in a snowstorm, why would you trust a map on a digital device? Maps are always interpretations. They're always arbitrary. And they're always sort of like on the bottom, subject to change. So let's take a look at a map. In fact, this is also a map, but it's also an example of a GIS system. So let's take a look at one. Okay, there's several types of GIS systems, or if you would, modern digital maps, but they're still two-dimensional representations of three-dimensional things, and they're always very, very simplified. So this is Google Earth. This is Google Earth Pro. This is what I want you guys to download. And this is one of them. This is the free one. Google makes their money in other ways, but this is actually a very good, sort of low bar GIS system. Much more sophisticated than Google Maps, by the way. There's ArcView, there's a bunch of different ones, and most of them are extremely expensive. And they're actually not much better in terms of functionality. So what you see here is we're looking at the Pacific. And now when you're looking at GIS systems or maps in general, digital maps, I think, give the illusion of more accuracy, but they're not. And so if we zoom in here, so we zoom into the island of Oahu. Now you notice as we're zooming in, if you visualize old style paper maps, we would have gone from one map that maybe would be the entire world to now we're doing a smaller map that might be the Hawaiian Islands. And now we're getting down to a map of the island of Oahu. Digital systems, or what we call geographic information systems, have the illusion of more detail just because they basically hide the layers of the map. Now, on one hand, you can see that here as we zoom in, the resolution gets more fine in terms of distance. In other words, the distance is shorter. And also, just as a note, there's all sorts of information here, like where exactly this is on the planet, what elevation we are looking at this part of the world from. If you notice over here on the left-hand side, what we actually have is the major part that makes these what we call geographic information systems. GISs, or geographic information systems, are nothing but maps. In fact, you can see Google's part addition to this is not only the fact that they put the photos in, so they've got aerial photos or satellite photos that are imagery, but they've also at some point they've drawn in the major road systems. As we move in more and more, we see these other road systems come in. These are layers, because if you notice when we zoomed out, we didn't see them. Now, if you zoom in and keep on zooming, we'll just very quickly zoom in here. At some point, you can actually end up with all the roads. At some point, you can end up with every car. If you're using some of the really sophisticated ones, like the military's version of a GIS system, you can actually read the license plates on the back of cars, and you can actually see a golf ball or a basketball if it was sitting here on the street, it would actually be visible. So the resolution of these things is sort of mind-blowing in terms of what it can have. The commercial ones like Google Earth don't have that resolution. Having said that, one of the options you have, which I recommend you'll use, move this here just a little bit. There's this little guy over here, this little statue. If you move that down into here, you can actually basically end up in the street. So you can actually visually walk the streets. Now, in some countries, they don't allow this. It's considered a security issue or a political thing, but it's usually considered some sort of national security thing. So they don't want you to be able to see the streets, or, for fear of terrorism or whatever. Most countries in Europe, the United States, and parts of Asia do have street access. So you can actually go through it. And you'll every once in a while see a Google car actually around, has looks like a big ball on the top of it. It's actually, as it goes down the street, it's actually recording a new version of this. Let's see if we actually go in here. Let's see what date this was done. So we're in Kapahulu. So this is Street View. And notice how we've gone from a view of the planet all the way down to a particular address. This particular imagery was captured in 2011, so it's already over 10 years out of date, which actually can be handy if you're looking for changes. For example, down the street, you can actually go and stand in that street now, take a set of pictures, and then compare them to what you've got here. And this is one of the richnesses of a GIS system. There's an enormous amount of information included in these systems. And very quickly here, let's see an example of that. Let's get to north again, so it's getting dizzy if I'm not north. Okay, this is the project one of the projects we're working on. This is the Palolo Pukele project, and this is basically in pink, which suddenly popped up, now disappeared. This is another map. So this is another layer to the Google information service or Google Earth Pro. And these are basically, just if you're interested, these are actually the claims that were made in the Mahele between 1848 and 1853 for property when land was given over to everyone. So each of these is a place that someone said, this belongs to me. And if you click here, you can actually add the names of all these people. And depending on what it is, since this is part of the project we're working on, we've actually added not only this, since all this is our input, but we've also actually all the testimony, at least in English, that we've got so far. of the person who wanted this piece of property and why they were saying they should get it. So this is one of the huge powers of GIS systems. If you actually look at this point now, it's really hard to see parts of Waikiki or even this section here, just because there's so much data and you've got an overload. And this is one of the huge problems you get into with maps. And this is why I mentioned maps are always arbitrary. You're always trying to decide what information you're going to show and what information you're not going to show. Because at some point, if you think about it, if you're going to have a description of everything of a particular house, let's go to this here. I'm going to have a description of a particular house here. That would include where the chairs are in the rooms. That would include where the doors are. That would include what type of cars I had. Everything went in there. By the time you actually put all that information down, there'd be nothing but a black blob because there'd be so much information you couldn't see anything. So maps are always selectively arbitrary. In fact, if you notice in this one, at this level, it puts the street names. It's got some places. As we move out, the street names start to disappear. As we move out here, now even the street markers will disappear. Okay, so what happens is in this case, it's automating the idea of what you see and what you don't see. But you can actually, if you want to fiddle with something like this, you can actually set it up to make it visible in different layers. So this is a geographic information system, and this is a key part of a map. Now, at some point, if you look at this, you notice that the Google highlights aren't necessarily accurate either. They're not exactly where the roads are. So if you were actually dumb enough for some reason to use Google Maps or Google Earth and try to drive down the road without looking at where you're going, you're going to end up in a tree or in someone's front yard or something like that, because these things are not that super accurate. They're designed as, again, interpretive representations of where major roads are, where the freeway is. And of course, they're static. They're fixed in a point in time. They're not dynamic. They're constantly being updated every second. So that's maps and GIS systems. Now, where it becomes very complicated is, for example, if you segue out, let's quickly change here. Sorry, just a little tired this morning. It's Friday, but it doesn't want to have to do anything. So again, here you see one of the other advantages of GIS systems is that basically it can, if you type in something, it'll help you find it. So now if we got the country of France here, here's Paris in the north, and here's Nice, Toulouse down in the south. And here's the border with Switzerland. Actually, let's use the border with Germany, since that's, your history, that's much more of a conflicted point. Here's places like Strasbourg. Somewhere in here, there should be Metz. I can never find Metz. But here's Strasbourg. Now, over the last, 800 something years, in fact, even in the Roman Empire, what you find is arguments between the guys that live on this side in terms of where the border is, and guys on this side in terms of where the border is. Many of the wars of the 17, 18, and 1900s that France was involved in against Germany had to do with where the border is. And what you find is in many countries, this is taken deadly seriously. A good example would be North Korea and South Korea. You get too near the border, you'll be shot. If you try to cross the border, you'll be arrested and or shot. And wars literally happen because someone decides that, well, this property on this side of the border should belong to Germany. Or someone over here, the French government says, well, the border in this time, and Kappel-Grafenhausen, that should belong to France. It's actually ours because back, 800 years ago, we used to have some houses there. And so you have a war to invade and take over property based literally on map boundaries. Maps on one hand, this is one of the terrifying thing about maps. On one hand, maps are entirely arbitrary. And if you notice, this boundary, it really isn't very good because here the river's over here and the line's here. So Google didn't get it exactly right. But even on top of that is the fact that in fact, I would argue all countries are deadly serious about their boundaries. And this is why when you go somewhere, for almost all countries in the world, when you get near their national borders, you'll find guards, you'll find barriers, walls, mines, everything. And crossing that, if you're in another country, is literally a declaration of war. So maps on one hand are arbitrary, but countries have an enormous fixation on their boundaries, on where their boundaries show up on a map. And it's one of the sort of weird human aspects of maps, especially if you're a geographer, is the fact that there's such powerful forces for making arguments about, well, I should kill this person, or I should take over this place and destroy this place because it should be on our side of the map. It should be on our side of the boundary. And something that's always important to remember is the fact that maps and boundaries on one hand are entirely arbitrary. On the other hand, that doesn't mean they're not significant. And the fact that they're arbitrary also means that, of course, is the French idea of where their border is. And I can guarantee that they don't, that the French and the Germans don't agree on where the boundary should be. Now, in some cases, it might literally be just a couple of feet. In other cases, it can be pretty big chunks of territory. But they don't agree. And that's because the maps are arbitrary. And that means all the lines on the maps and the boundaries on the maps are arbitrary. And so they're all interpretive. And not surprisingly, they're going to be designed or drawn in such a way that makes your side look better and makes the bad guys or the folks you don't like look worse. And that's the reality of maps. We'll see some actually the most famous, probably not right now, in Asia would be the 996 map that the Chinese have generated, which basically says everything in sort of the Western Pacific Ocean should belong to them because it did sort of maybe once about 900 years ago. That's actually driving their foreign policy. It drives their military expansion. It drives almost everything they're doing. And it drives the conflict with the countries around them, which is getting very close to the shooting point. And that's how important a map is. You could end up with World War III because of a disagreement about a map.